I have taken the Myers-Briggs so many times. I think I've got all the questions memorized. Obviously the first letter in the Myers-Briggs kind of gives you some insight into how you process. Where do you draw energy from being an extrovert, or do you draw energy for being an introvert? Introverts, they're not people who don't like, they like people. Most of the time we think introverts are people who, no, they love people. They like being with people. They just get energy from a smaller group of people and not a large group. So I would argue that Tozer is an introvert just because of his disciplines, his practice. If you don't know where you sit, and this is very helpful when it comes to spiritual practice, don't try to be something that you're not. Okay? Which means if you're an extrovert and you love, that's how you're wired, well, at times embrace disciplines that are easier for introverts over extroverts. So you do need to push yourself in some degree. But I remember when I was coming out of seminary, a number of seminary professors are introverts. All these books I was reading were written by introverts, and I thought, gosh, man, I don't do any of this stuff, I'm sit in the corner in the class because I was the odd person out. And I went to see one of my professors, and he finally just said, look, he's wired you in pretty tight. Don't stop trying to be something that you're not. Just embrace who you are and how you operate with that in your faith practice. But there will be some disciplines that are easy for you. There are some that are not. Don't try to map in just because we read something by Tozer, and Tozer spent 5 hours in prayer, and and the average person spends 2 or 3 minutes. Spend more than 2 or 3 minutes, but don't try to be Tozer. Be who you are. Allow God to use that and how you grow. So that one was for free. Has nothing to do with the class. Anyways, we've looked at Tozer. Last century, was considered a Christian mystic because of his heavy stance on experience. His word is intimacy. So let me stop before we begin. Is there anything coming out of chapter 1? I talked a little bit about it a couple of weeks ago. John talked some about it last week. That still is a little fuzzy, or something that you love or hate, or just something that you would like to acknowledge before we move on? Did everybody read chapter 1? Okay, good. So we're all on the same page. All right, fantastic. And it might not be anything. You got two shots at it with John and me. Hopefully it's clear. If not, maybe we'll throw somebody else in here, and see if they can get it right. All right, so here we are. So we're going into chapter 2. For Tozer, now keep in mind, he's writing as a reformer, which means what reformers do, and this is any time in history, they take an assessment of the world around them, and they see things that are lacking. And their job is they want to bring whatever they see back to something that they either perceive or know was either functioning better, was a higher quality, or whatever it may be. So Tozer is looking to bring his community, mid-20th century, and the church. Now he's writing to Christians. He's not writing to people outside the church. He's writing to people. We talked about justification and sanctification. Justification is the moment someone becomes a Christian. They can't get any more of a Christian there. It's a legal term. God deems them as redeemed, as a Christian. They're still going to grow into that, which is that sanctification piece. But he's writing to people who have been justified. His goal is to help people on the sanctification track. That's my terms, not his. And what he wants to do is bring the people inside the church back to something that is more in line where there's not just knowledge of God, but there's relationship with God, or there's intimacy with God. His assessment of the mid-20th century is that we have plenty of people who have helped others know about God, knowledge. Plenty of teaching on theology, plenty of teaching on the attributes of God and what have you. But he sees something lacking, and that is for the average person, this right here, relationship with God, is not up, not on the same level as the amount of knowledge of God. Now, the goal of faith is to have both. And so at different points in the church's history, you'll find where reformers will call for knowledge of God, more knowledge of God, because they assess that relationship with God is pretty strong. And then there are times where there will be different reformers that say knowledge of God is plentiful, relationship with God is lacking, and so they call for more. All your mystics are advertising and want people to move back towards relationship with God, something that you experience. So when we get into chapter 4, he's going to talk about how does a person experience another personality or another person. And he's going to talk about senses. You taste, you can smell, you can hear, you can touch. And he'll make the jump in how that plays out in the life of a person with God. So he's calling for this, which is why when you read Tozer, you don't get a ton of theology. Now, he does have theological statements in there, but he's not giving you some systematic understanding of who God is, what God has done, all the three persons of the Trinity and what historical thought and development of all. All that's just assumed that people have knowledge of God. I think in the first chapter he even talks about the issue is not from a lacking of teachers. Got plenty of teachers. What's lacking is for the average person inside the church to have the same way that you might have a relationship with another person that has vitality, that has energy and strength, and it adds to your life, you add to that person's life, that needs to also take place with God inside the life of the average person. All right? So he wants to, the whole purpose of this book and his companion piece is how do we have more intimacy with God, not necessarily more knowledge. All right? And because there's plenty of knowledge that is out there. And so at the end of chapter 1, he says the big issue for the reader is to really look at what he calls a hungering for God. And he quotes the psalmist, "As the deer pants for water, so my soul longs for thee." So the first question that we ask coming out of chapter 1 is, levels of longing that we have to want to be with God. And the only person who can judge where you're at on that is you. But if you are longing for something more when it comes to God, or to maybe use our language, if you're longing for something more out of your faith, then Tozer would say you are on the right path. That's where it all begins. At some point it has to be a longing to want to be with God. So chapter 2 is, what does that look like? Because it's fairly vague language, and the church is good at giving vague language. It's kind of like, what's that? Do what? Well, yeah, then the church and the federal government are the same. We're really good at saying, well, what does Galatians say about the fruits of the Spirit? Does anybody know what those are? All right, love, joy, peace. Yeah, so long-suffering. So we're really good at saying love more. Yeah, what else? Be more joyful, right? Be more at peace. Be more, have more endurance. Forgive people, right? You've heard those sermons, right? We preach them, they're a dime a dozen, right? And so we're really good at giving vague language of what the end game should be. but not so much on how that happens. Because when John and I stand up and say, well, one of the fruits of the Spirit is joy, and obviously you're a Christian, which means you have the fruits of the Spirit in you, and you should have joy in your life. That should be a characteristic of your life. And then, do you have joy in your life? How much? How much is the adequate amount? What does it mean to have joy in your life? Or to be at peace? Any of you not at peace? Right? So, show our hands. Everybody's raising their hands, right? So, it's okay. I already know the answers. So, we're just good at the vague language. Be a better Christian. Be more kind, right? Well, that's good in this classroom, but then when you leave, somebody's going to cut you off going to lunch today. And, so, it's, how do you do that? So what does that look like? If Tozer says, all right, coming out of chapter 1, what we need is more intimacy with God. Well, what on earth is more intimacy with God? All right, so when I say intimacy with God, what just comes to your mind? Prayer. All right, so got to pray more, right? So what else? Study. All right, so... Right, so a constant talking, right. Dependence. What's interesting is none of y'all have said the same answer.
Well, you don't have to have one answer.
Well, Tozer says intimacy, all right? So I'm going to ask the question, what is intimacy? Closeness, okay. Again, vague language, not real clear on what that means. And so this is going. I know the answer to this, and I probably don't need to do this, but I've been up since 4, so why not? Do y'all ever watch Seinfeld?
Yes.
All right. So I'm dating myself. All right. So if you don't watch Seinfeld, just check out for about 10 seconds, and that's fine. But there's I watch Seinfeld. My generation loves Seinfeld. All right. So this is kind of like, MASH or Cheers or whatever it may be. But there's one of the main characters named Jerry Seinfeld. His neighbor's named Kramer. And Kramer is this eccentric, kind of all over the place guy. And there's this one scene where Jerry, the comedian Seinfeld, and Kramer are sitting across where they always sit at the diner. And he looks at Jerry and says, "Jerry, do you ever yearn?" And Jerry's like, "Yearn? What are you talking about?" Yeah, well, so do you long? Do you hunger? And in specific case, to leave Seinfeld, get back to A.W. Tozer, do you yearn and long to be with God? Well, what does that look like? That's chapter 2. So for Tozer, the way he starts chapter 2 is that he gives this theological construct. So this is something where he is talking a little bit about theology, and it's an assumption that the reader already knows, that inside the heart of a person, or inside the heart of humanity, it was a shrine that was created by God, that only God was worthy enough to dwell in. Bible verses, maybe Jeremiah 24, Jeremiah 31. But what has happened, this goes back to classical Christian theology, that because of sin, that has introduced complications to what originally God had desired for humanity. And for Tozer, this is Augustine's theology, so this predates Tozer. Augustine theology says God creates humanity, sin enters the world, it mars humanity, which means then there's now a void inside the life of a person that originally was designed for God, and humanity tries to fill that void with everything but God. All right, you probably have heard sermons on that, right? That's classical Christian theology. But what is the result of this revolt, to use that language? Genesis 3 would be the example of that if you're looking for a Bible verse, is that it has ruined the soul. So my page, chapter 22, which would probably be more like chapter 29, 30, if you find it, There's a quote that says, "Our woe began when God was forced out of His central shrine and the things were allowed to enter." Page 11. How did I even get to page 22? I don't even know. So, so y'all have page 11? Wow. Becky, what page you got? You don't have page 11. I can promise you that. Becky has a... well, I tell you what. Page 11 then. It is. Can't argue with that. Which results in no inward peace. All right? Now, here's the good news. You don't need Tozer to tell you that to probably know that's real or true. And so what results out of this for Tozer, he says, is what looks like, because of this central place inside the heart of humanity, that, to use Old Testament language, was a shrine that was set up just for God, but because of sin, God has been pushed out of that shrine, and humanity has placed other things inside of that shrine, which then has its own negative effects inside the life of the person. For Tozer, then, what develops is this love. Now, I'm going to put an added word, this twisted love for, and he calls it enemy. Now, he's not referring to like the devil or Satan or anything like that. For him, the enemy is anything other than God. Okay, so in chapter 2, he's going to talk about love. They're loving the enemy more than God. He is not referring to Satan. So don't make that assumption. Okay? But out of that, this twisted love, and that's the key word there has developed what he calls this self-life. All right? Maybe a better term for us is that selfishness, to use the gospel, what? Yeah, to use the gospel language, we're the lovers of ourselves more than the lovers of God. That then has produced, or at least the way it's manifested, is in language like my, mine. He also says gain and profit. Now he doesn't, he doesn't define these per se. He's just sort of laying out what happens when God's the place that was designed for God has been. I just marred up the wall. Y'all didn't see that, did y'all? So don't tell the trustees. Helen, turn away. Mary Lou, y'all didn't see that. Yeah, it's like this before, right? So, yeah, it's a good thing we didn't do a punch list here, So, so once God was kicked out of that shrine inside a person's life, this develops. And what happens is people then, again, not any of the people inside this room, but people become consumed with things. Right? Which, again, we're just talking about hypotheticals because none of us are ever consumed with things, right? Didn't think so. So for those other people, this is how it plays out. Now, on one of the sheet that I passed out to you, I think on the back side of that is part of Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel spends a great deal of time talking about humanity's consumption with things other than God. And we could probably just plate a number of scripture verses that show up inside of our understanding, or maybe ones that we are aware of, where people have been, where this plays out in the life is the consumption with things, or now things for him, or it could be a person. All right, so I think I told you one of the chapters in the book came out of his, I think his fifth or sixth child was his daughter. Had sons up until then. And when his daughter was born, inside of his own journals, Tozer wrote about how, he went to church, and that denomination does not do infant baptisms. They have christenings, and so they did the christening service. And on his way home, he became incredibly convicted, because as he was driving home for lunch, he said in his mind, "I know what I told God. I just know that I also didn't believe it. I wasn't giving my daughter over to God because she was mine." So this is part of where he's getting chapter 2. It's coming out of his own experience. And so for things could be people. All right? Doesn't necessarily have to be, but it's interpret that to be anything other than God in primacy or first. Now, against this, or what should take place, or what he's hoping to take place, that all starts with this hungering for God, is this idea of, instead of love of enemy, again, not necessarily Satan or the devil or just anything, is a love for Christ and a love for God, which then creates, instead of a self-life, it's what Tozer calls life eternal. Now, don't think with life eternal just in the by and by. Because in chapter 4, he talks about life eternal being now and not yet. But he hadn't gotten that far, so let me just, it's easy for us to think when we hear life eternal, what do you think about? Heaven, that's right, which is in the future. We don't think about it so much as in right now. The Gospels, and both the New Testament, they talk about life eternal as in all three tenses, which is interesting to me. You don't really get this much in the English, but you definitely get it in the Greek. Whenever the New Testament writers talk about faith, and particularly salvation, that word sozo, which is that's the Greek word for salvation, it talks about it in the past tense, it talks about it in the present tense, like it's happening right at this very moment, and then it also talks about it in the future tense, and it uses them all interchangeably. Now we think, I was saved, and I will go to heaven, right? But in the New Testament, it's all three happening at the same time. If you can, you got to get your mind around metaphysics and God outside of time and space. But it's interesting that in the New Testament, when it talks about salvation, or life eternal, it's was, is, and will be all in one. Now, the reason why I tell you that is because, to me, that's incredibly comforting. When you think about that. Most people, it's been my experience when it comes to people of faith in the church, is more times than not, they come to faith maybe out of fear, and then their life, they see their life of obedience, not in joyful obedience, like we say whenever we take communion, but in obedience as if I have to pay God back for what God has given me. Right? Okay, maybe not at this group, but you are the minority, I promise you. And then the reward of paying back is heaven. It's just the New Testament doesn't talk about it that way. It's grace given, was given, is given right now, will be given in the future. And so I tell you that to where if people who have a tendency to experience guilt or shame, now you know what the difference is, right? Shame is when you feel bad about what you are. Guilt is when you feel bad about what you've done. But people who experience that first are easier to go there than to go towards forgiveness, then I would invite you to reflect more on the tenses of salvation. Was, is, will be, all together. At least that's been my experience. So, what he's hoping is love of Christ, and this is just a Greek symbol for Christ. Love of Christ, which leads, instead of a love, a self-life, life eternal, and then seen in where he quotes Matthew's gospel of take up your cross and follow, which then leads to, he doesn't use the word surrender, but I will use it. And the idea is that possessing nothing. He uses the word possessing nothing. So these are the way that this is what he would say the reality of people whenever this shrine that God has, this is what's happened. People have moved God out of the central shrine, and this is what develops. So the movement then is to put God back in the shrine, which leads to these things. And hungering for God is the beginning of moving from here into there. Which, if I'm going to say it's page 22, but it's probably going to be more like page 12. The way to deeper knowledge of God is through the lonely valleys of soul poverty and abnegation of all things. Again, page 13. Thank you. Y'all said that with some force, let me tell you. These blessed poor are no longer slaves to the tyranny of things. They have broken the yoke of the oppressor. Now, I have a question. Is this like an all or nothing deal? Or is there degrees of this? Because the chief example that Tozer cites to help illustrate this is Abraham and Isaac, which is why you have on the front part of that page that was passed out, that particular text in Genesis chapter 22. And he also quotes Matthew 16 about Jesus is the Christ. Now, so to familiarize ourselves with those texts, if you want to read them, that's fine. You have the text there. But basically, there's a long-awaited promise from God to Abraham that Abraham was going to have a child. They waited. Nothing happened. Took matters in their own hand. Had a son through Hagar. Eventually, Sarah becomes pregnant, has Isaac. And right after the birth narrative in the book of Genesis, right after that, you have this really difficult chapter of Genesis chapter 22, which has to do with Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Now, I'm just curious, what's the first thing you think about when you hear about that story? Horrible, pain, offensive. That would be my word, offensive. And and then you have the New Testament version of that, which is Jesus is sitting Caesarea Philippi. That's on the backdrop of all these altars. And Jesus goes to Peter and says, who do people say that I am in light of all these altars? Peter stands up and says, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. Jesus basically says, you answered correctly. And then immediately he talks about what that means, which means suffering servant. And Peter then protests. And then Jesus' response is, now you've missed the boat, big guy. You're totally missing it. And then the end of that chapter, he talks about if a person wants to save their life, they have to lose it, possessing nothing. So that's the tie-in between the Genesis 22 and the Matthew chapter 16. So when we read the text in Genesis, what is so difficult for us, obviously in our day and time, is that the idea that God would tell somebody to sacrifice a child or whatever. Now, you do need to see that inside the context of Abraham's day and not 2018 United States. Child sacrifices all around Judaism took place all the time. And it was very typical in other religions. And Abraham comes out of another religion. His father was a priest in another. It wasn't Judaism, right? Judaism really wasn't formed then. It starts with Abraham, But so Abraham is a religious person. He comes from a religious family. Hears sense from God. He needs to leave his family. He leaves modern day Iraq, travels all the miles over to what is now Israel. At that time, it was Canaan. And it's there that he has a promise from God, all those things that we read about from Genesis 12 to Genesis 22. But it was not uncommon for people to sacrifice their firstborn, particularly first male. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that Judaism, if you compare Judaism to other religions of that time and day, they take a stance against that. But that hadn't happened yet. All right? So, it happens after Abraham. But there are plenty of Canaanite religions where they would sacrifice their first child as an act of devotion to deity. So we read the story and it's appalling. Cannot believe that God would be so offensive to act, but inside of that, we're reading into the text some of the things that we have from our culture, and their culture, it was a little bit different. What's interesting is that Abraham, does he sacrifice Isaac? Why not? Right. But he was willing. That's exactly right. So, in our case...
But he had in mind the whole time, God will save him, or God will revive him, so it wasn't as if he was...
Well, we don't know that for sure. Yeah. All we do know from Abraham... all we do know from Abraham... Yeah, now what Tozer says is that Abraham had to have gotten to a place to where surely God would provide. Yeah, all the text says is that when Abraham asks, what's going on, God will provide. Now, Tozer is giving us some commentary about Abraham, that Abraham would, thought that if he even went through with it, somehow God was going to redeem the situation. But that is not in Genesis chapter 22, if that makes sense. Now, I think Tozer, I think inside the mindset of Abraham, that there was, in order to be willing to do it, I would argue with Tozer that, in agreement with him, that somehow beyond Abraham's understanding, God was somehow going to redeem this because of, why would God take away the promise that God has given? Does that make sense?
Because Abraham had been promised.
That's right. Many descendants, all that, yeah. Right. So I don't think Tozer's wrong to draw that conclusion. I'm just making it, that is not in Genesis chapter 22. All right. So, but Beth, what you said, intention is critical. Because he also goes on to say inside the chapter that although Abraham possessed nothing, he gained everything. Do you remember that in the story? In the chapter? I actually have the quote, and I'm sure it's not the right page number. However, so the intention that we would be willing to give up is just as important, maybe even more important, because normally function or actions follow thought or intention. That the willingness that regardless of what it is, people or things, we would want to be, what would be first in that shrine, to use chapter 2 language, is God first. All right, does that make sense? He goes on, now I got page 27, so it's probably, yeah, all right, read that for me, please.
He had everything, but he possessed nothing.
Yeah.
There is the Spirit.
Right. That's right. And so there's, he also says, Tozer, after that bitter and blessed experience, I think the words of my and mine never again had the same meaning for Abraham. That might not be the same page, but it's in that general area.
Yeah.
Okay.
His real treasures were inward and eternal.
Right. So, but for him, and this is Tozer's point, Whether or not somebody actually has to surrender all things, have no idea. Okay? The key is, would you be willing? So inside this shrine, inside the heart of the person, what ultimately is most important? Well, yeah, all right, so no, it should be and ought. I mean, but the issue for all of us, and that's why I'm pausing for a moment, the issue for all of us is to wrestle with that question. Because it's not easy. And Tozer goes on to talk about the pain that Abraham would have traveled through in order to get to the place of surrender. Now, it's easy to, say this or talk about this. I mean, it's much harder to live this out just because of the love that you have for family and things of that nature. But at some point, all that becomes part of the conversation when it comes to love of God, if that makes sense. Did I mention, we taught Wesley's Order of Salvation? Remember that? All right, so it's worth dusting this off. You have to go back a few years. All right, I'm on my 7th year. I think we talked about this like year 1. So, I don't even know if we have that archived then. But if you can imagine stairs, to use right here is where Wesley would say conversion experience takes place. People, there's sin that is involved, to use Tozer's language, born at some point, there's sin that mars the image of God. God, through prevenient grace, which is just the grace that God gives before someone responds to it, leads us up to a place of conversion. Now, conversion can be like Paul, where you're going down this way and blinding light, and it's, and you've seen people and it's like just all together, just huge experience. Or it could be that someone grows up inside the family of God and at a point says, this is what I want to continue to do, all right? So conversion doesn't have to be, this Paul experience where, we classify ourselves as the worst sinner in the world and God reached down into the depths of what, that happens, okay? I'm not saying it's both of them is my point. That there are people who grow up where their whole experience of life is this wooing of God from they've always known that. And then at some time when they're able to make that move from there to there, it's an easy step. Now, the truth is, I hope everybody that experiences any ministries of St. Paul, this is how it plays out in their life. And you'll hear me on Sundays talk about often where we want to create an environment here at St. Paul that makes it incredibly easy for people, regardless of age or life or whatever it may be, that the move from here to there is just an easy step. But sometimes it's not, and you have a Paul experience or whatever. So Wesley says there's a moment that someone claims their faith for their own, whether it's a dramatic experience or whether it's just a seamless, from one side to the other. And the first thing that happens is that people long for some level of assurance. For what they did is actually it. And so there's, Wesley says the way assurance takes place is two means. One is the Bible or theology, things of the church says this is what a Christian does, and then you look at your own life and able to deduce that, well, if they say this is what a Christian does, and I'm doing them, then therefore I must be a Christian. But he also, so that's one way. The other way is, we'll just say Bible. The other way is he would say the Holy Spirit literally conveys to the person in some level of personal experience, yes, you are. He says, now this is the one you really want, but both of them happen. Okay? It would be like someone tells you that, a third party tells you that, said person loves you. All right? That's sort of like this. But it's far better when there's a personal experience with that person and you know that you are loved. That'd be a good example of that. And so people long for assurance. Once there's level of like, yeah, I understand that I am saved. I am a Christian. The next thing that happens after assurance is then you start to deal with the real issue of your heart. The idea that even though I know that I am a Christian, there are still things inside of me that do not reflect the nature of Christ. And he says, there lies the real movement. This is more talking about justification. This is talking about sanctification. And so people become convicted again, like down here, through the grace of God, that there's still things inside that just haven't really fully been put to death. Now notice that Wesley and classical Christian theology would say, still a Christian. Okay? Still a Christian and sin. All right? For instance, how many of you have sinned since becoming a Christian? Yeah, exactly right. Right. So, how many? Maybe we should, should tweak that. We just. But the idea is justified, fully Christian. Can't get any more Christian than what you are right now, and yet there's still things that we do that do not reflect the nature of Christ. But at some point, as we're growing in grace, we get to the literal heart of the matter, that there are things not so much on the outside behaviors, even though there might be, but the real issue, those things on the inside that no one sees. Now, the church, historically, has called these the 7 deadly sins. Because you can't see them. But we know that they're there. All right, so what are some of the 7 deadlies? Greed, lust, pride, bitterness, sloth. Hey, y'all got it, man. A+, so... but you got the 7, those are all things on the inside. And you can mask these. All right, you can. And you can do things that the only people that know that these things exist are you and God. And if you're really good, just you and God. If not so much, then you, God, and the people who are closest to you. But my point is, the average will never see these. Because they're more inward in their nature than outward. I mean, not a Christian, become a Christian. In this longing for assurance, there are going to be things that are part of your behaviors that change. Talk differently, act differently, things of that nature. And you can live there and be fine, but at some point there'll be, again, to use Tozer's language now, this longing inside of us that there's still things that aren't at rest because, again, Tozer's language, we move back and forth with allowing God to sit inside this central shrine, and sometimes yes, sometimes no. You with me? All right? So the issue there for Wesley and Tozer is the heart. And to use chapter 2 language, we come to the realization that we really might be consumed with things. Again, things can be anything other than God. But what's really required is the intent or the willingness to make sure that God is here. This is chapter 2. So, I mean, it's well in line. The only reason I'm bringing in Wesley is just give you... And Wesley takes 200 years of Protestant Reformation, Calvin, all them, he has 200 years of processing, right? So he's not, just because we talk about Wesley doesn't mean we're not talking about Calvin and things like that. He just comes after that, so he's writing about it after 200 years of reflection. So this is classical Christian. But what sits for all of us is this. Now, Wesley would say, at some point, through the grace of God, there's going to become a level of conviction, not just a one-time conviction, but maybe through a constant conviction, that there are things inside of me, like 7 deadly sins, that I know are there. Again, you're a Christian, not like you're not a Christian, they're just there. And what do I do with them? Well, again, through the work of God's grace, not different grace, just a different way we talk about it, through sanctifying grace, God moves to his central place, to use Tozer's language, which then creates levels of growth, again with assurance first, but this is where you might see maybe some of the language that we might use today is stuff like, oh, they're on fire for God. You ever heard of that stuff? So I mean, you see that, and you see their nature changing. Now, Shane's term is this is where you really see a deep maturation of faith. I like that language. So, but I have to bow down to Wesley and Tozer because they're pretty good too. So I mean, but this is where you see a huge maturing inside the life of a person when it comes to their faith. Because they're willing, intent-wise, to give up everything. If that was the case. Now, often what happens, that's not the case. So you can play games with God or whatever, but only you know if the intent is there that says, God, listen, I want to be here. So teach me to be here. Help me to be here. Well, and at some point, it'll involve the things that are most important to you. Ooh, yeah, we're at a break time. Somebody raise your hand next time. We went for a long time. Okay, is that like within days or? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and come back together. Do want to give you one update to your prayer list if it's not on there. Please put Kay Young on, and it looks like facing some back surgery in the pretty near future to alleviate some issues. So do pray for Kay and their larger family. All right, so we got just a handful of minutes, so we'll jump back in. So one of the things that to kind of go back and look at Abraham and even the Matthew text about I think where it says take up your cross and follow me. Of course, the idea is that the willingness to do that is as important, maybe if not more important, because it deals with the heart and desire and identity and things of that nature of a person than even having to follow through on it. And the only person that can tell if that's an authentic desire of the person is the person. I mean, you can't tell if the person next to you is authentic when it comes to that. I mean, so you can only control what's inside your own life, particularly inside your own heart or your own sense of identity and what have you. So for Tozer, one of the things that I thought was interesting, again, this is my page 27. It's probably going to be page 13, I think. There can be no doubt that this possessive clinging to things is one of the most harmful habits in the life because it's, I've got a typo here. Maybe it's sin natural or something. It is so natural. Thank you. Where's my pen? So natural. It is rarely recognized for the evil that it is, but its outworkings are tragic. That's page 17. Well, okay. The question is, how old was Isaac? I'd have to go back and look. I don't think it says it specifically. Yeah, so I mean, there's probably, preteen, teenager. No, probably not teenager. Maybe preteen. I'm guessing. We really don't know. We just know it. I mean, just because. Yeah, there are some physical clues. He is able to process where's the lamb or where's the sacrifice, which means he would have had to have been old enough to understand what their family style of worship is and the level of being able to hold something, So it's pure speculation. There's part of me that says he obviously wasn't a full teenager because I don't know if you've ever tried to tie down a teenager, particularly a teenage boy. I'd be real quick on, Dad, what are you doing? So I remember, it's interesting how there's always a time in a boy's life where, they want to kind of, see how far they can go with the dad. And even if it's just wrestling, it could be fun. Sometimes it could be very serious. But I remember one time when I think it was when Connor was in high school, and he and I were wrestling in our living room, and the thought occurred to me, he's pretty strong. And, so I thought I'm going to have to eat my Wheaties going forward, So, I mean, obviously not that age. I mean, I would imagine then he would have probably not have been so subservient to willingness to be sacrificed. So, yes.
I was wondering, we were talking about Isaac being maybe a pre-teenager. How old were these kids that were being sacrificed?
They would be babies.
Okay.
Yeah, they would be early on. In foreign religions, it was not long after birth. And a lot of them were. I mean, the way it happened is well, we're not going to get into that. That's neither here nor there. But that happened in foreign religions of the area, not Judaism. So if Tozer is dealing with this whole heart issue, one of the things I asked of myself when I was reading the chapter is, well, what prevents us from moving in that direction? His language is willing to give up treasures to the Lord. My first answer to that would probably be fear. It's amazing. Unfortunately, if I had to answer what's the largest influence inside of our society, I would say it's fear, not faith. I think that inside the life of, well, here's a good example. I'll just speak first person. Y'all know that we dropped Connor off college a couple of months ago. He's at Kennesaw for first 30 hours to see if he can transfer, but we don't know. He pledged a fraternity, so I think he might like that, so we'll see. Yeah, that has its own issues. So, pardon me? Some godforsaken place that's up in the northeastern part of our state, and which starts with an A. The state, or the city starts with an A. Yeah, he does, doesn't he? So did I ever tell you about the time we dropped him as a baby? I think that must have been the reason why. But I would be happy for him to go to Georgia. I'm fine with that. And so he's still fleshing out whether or not he wants to go there. So we'll see. A lot of his friends are there, so I think that's a huge draw. So what would prevent us? I think part of it is the idea of fear. Now, for some of you who've already had this experience, one of the things that was an issue that for Brooke and myself is, you drop off your child at college, and it's easy to talk about all the things that you want either for him or to her to know, but driving away and realizing that there are so many things that can happen, both good and bad. Now, it was easier for us to play out the bad more so than the good. All right, so am I average? I hope so. All right, was that y'all's experience? Okay, good. So I'm average. All right. I like the herd. And but my point is, it's easier for us to play the fear narrative out in our life more so than the faith narrative. And so when it comes to surrender or giving up, whatever it may be, I think one of the biggest hurdles for us inside the church today, I would say it's also been it's a human condition, is particularly around the things that you love the most, is to see what could go wrong more so than what could go right. Or at least that is, I would say, is a characteristic of our society. Maybe in some other societies where, that are not so child-centric. We have a to a fault. We are a child-centric society. I don't think that. I think that has some positives, but I think the negatives outweigh the positive. But one of the negatives that play out of that is that it's easy for us to see all the negatives, which then we're faced with the situation: do we become then over-functioning or over-protective, which then hurts the child and hurts us because we don't allow the child the certain events that they must go through to lead to levels of maturity. The greatest learning lessons are not in the vacuum. All right, so let's leave a child-parent relationship. The greatest learning lessons for all of us is in the wilderness, to use the biblical language. Most of us don't grow when life is easy. Now you might, and if you do, pat yourself on the back, because that's fantastic. But most of us grow through, the oyster is made through the friction. The pearl, yeah, sorry. You know what I mean. Inside the oyster. But friction is a good thing. So there's level of growth through that. So the friction, the oyster, for Isaac, right, for Abraham, the pearl, was the going through the process of what might have been. Now he didn't have to, but what comes out of that is a totally different Abraham. All right, so what's the response that God gives to Abraham when it's over? Now I know for sure. Now the assumption is it was in doubt. Maybe even also in Abraham's mind. You with me? So there's something through, which is why when we talk about how does intimacy created with God, obviously it involves the Holy Spirit, so it's definitely something that God does. But the part that we can control in our response to that, we tap into that first through disciplines. Well, disciplines by nature are not easy because they require time and energy, right? To study, to pray, either to go through silence, to do solitude, to be generosity, to do service. All that requires something of you that either involves your hands, your time, your resources, whatever. At some point, it trickles back down to the heart. But it requires movement. It requires levels of activity. And in the process of that, well, how do your muscles become strong? Yeah. You mean by me sitting on the couch? No. That's atrophy by resistance, which means you got to work. And so, I mean, there's the reason why fasting is a discipline that has all kinds of benefits, but is least practiced today. Why? Because it's 100% giving up. Yeah. So all that wonderful cake that I saw some of you eating, whoever made that, that's like, you should be ashamed of yourself to bring that into here. Let me tell you, it's I could smell that as soon as it came in the door. So who did that? Let me see. But I mean, do what? Yeah, exactly right. So, but it's, if you really want to grow, seriously, mature in your faith, start fasting. I'm not talking about just with food, whatever. I mean, what are the 3 things you love to do? Just write that down. You don't have to tell me. Just write it down. Stop doing it for a period of time. Well, I mean, what's going to happen is for about, the first hour, it's going to feel, oh yeah, I got this. It's not that hard at all. And then all of a sudden, you're not doing it, and then you got to sit with what to do with your time, right? People who are trying to stop smoking, you know what one of the first biggest problems for them? What to do with their fingers. Because they're used to something. There is a mental connection to this. And so to do this, a lot of times you see them carrying things. Okay? Why? Well, because this is a form of fasting. Not just the physical withdrawal of that, but it's larger than that. It's what do I do now with those things that I used to with my fingers. So, I mean, there's a reason why fasting is a discipline that has all kind of benefits but is seldom tapped into because it is painful, right? So what do we do? What prevents us? I would argue first and foremost fear. Maybe a derivative of that is some level of selfishness, but I think fear is the largest influence into why not. But let's just say we want to walk down the road with Tozer, and so how do we move into what Tozer is getting at in chapter 2. Now this is the steps that he talks about. Maybe not in these terms, but this is what he's getting at the end of the chapter. First and foremost is just he says put away all defenses. What I would say is just recognize things for what they are. That are there times inside of your life, to use his language, where the shrine inside the heart, there's something else in that other than God. Because just to admit that is painful. Right? So who wants to admit, all right, so y'all, we were real quick to name the 7 deadlies, right? Oh yeah, we know them because, but who wants to stand up and say, yeah, you know what my real problem is? I'm this. Not that that's a problem. I am this. All right? So just try that, okay? I mean,
I remember when we first talked about the 7 deadly sins maybe a couple of years ago, one of the things you said was that not that each of these things in itself was awful,
right.
but that it came between you and God.
Sure. the origins of all of the 7 deadly sins has its beginning in something that actually is holy. It just becomes perverted. And in the perversion, it becomes the deity. I mean, it's amazing how that all, we'll save that for another lesson. But, I mean, if you can see that, just spend some time on that. I mean, think what the origin of, greed is or something. I mean, the basic concept for security. Right? Or, it's not murder. It's actually, I think it's more hatred than murder in the 7 deadlies. But the idea of hatred starts with love that gets perverted. The reason why we have bitterness is because somebody close to us that we love and trust does something that alters that love and trust. So it starts with love or affection or whatever it may be, and it gets perverted, not necessarily from our own, could have some help from someone else, but it gets perverted, and then it moves into bitterness. Hebrews does the best example of this in the New Testament, where it talks about don't let the root of bitterness, take form in your life. And the root is perfect because it's under the surface. But all of them have a beginning with something that is not evil. It starts with something that's good. It just gets perverted, and it evolves into something that then becomes, the center of the life, and it becomes controlling, whole 9 yards. So how do we? So if we don't want that to happen, or maybe so if we want to find a style of life, identity that's different from that, Tozer would say the first thing to do is, now he says, put away all defenses. The defenses. What I would say is, just don't justify it. Just acknowledge it for what it is. All right? That doesn't change anything in your life other than at least what you're dealing with. Recognize it for what it is. We have such a healthy spiritual denial when it comes to the 7 deadlies that it's almost too painful to acknowledge that it's even there. The first time I realized that, I think I was in college. I went to a church, and there was at a church where still had Sunday night services, and you could have like open mic prayer requests, which we are never going to do here at St. Paul. I just want you to know. But in that church they did it, and this guy stood up and he said, "I need you to pray for me." He goes, "Man, I lust all the time," and it was like he said, "I've got Ebola." People literally went. It's like, if I get close to this guy, it's going to come up on me, and I'm across the church, and I saw that, and I thought, wow, so I was like, note to self, never do that. So we, just acknowledge whatever it is. I'm not saying have open mic, but at least between you and God, acknowledge that it's real, and it's an influence. Okay? Next thing he would say do is that then consider the magnitude of what is to what you hope becomes, to use this language, is that this is something that process is something that is a holy endeavor. That it's not trivial. That it's not something you're going to take lightly, that this is something that matters both to you and that matters to God. It's sacred. Well, things in the Bible that are sacred, God takes ownership of. So you can't forget that. See, a lot of times when we think that, all right, let's just say it's, to use the example, lust or greed or whatever. It could be anger, hatred, whatever. Whatever it is, the 7 deadlies. Where's my stuff? Whatever it is, we acknowledge it, and that we're not going to play any games with it. But the fact that we belong to God and we know that this is an holy endeavor and that it's sacred, then what that should also reassure you is that this is not a solo project. See, often when we think growing in holiness, we think that is something that we do, again, to show God how much we love God. It is not. I mean, that's a half-truth. Growing in holiness is not a solo endeavor. It's something we do with the aid of the Holy Spirit. And I would argue, without that, there's no way that you can do it. It's like if we stood up, I'm going to try this on Sunday. Y'all tell me if this will work. If I stand up on Sunday and I'm going to say, just stop being greedy. Stop being lustful. Stop being lazy. Stop being bitter. Stand for the benediction. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, it's talk less, But the idea is like, okay, thanks a lot. How you going to do that? Well, consider that you do it. You do it with the Holy Spirit, and acknowledge that the experience of going from what is to what will be is something that will be both painful, will carry with it something that will bring pain, and at the same time will bring blessing. Let's bring Wesley back into the page. Wesley said that often people who are on this endeavor are in the throes of new birth. Now, not new birth like being going from not a Christian to a Christian, but in like pregnancy, giving birth. Now, I've only witnessed two, but I've been around a bunch. It's one of the greatest things about my job. I mean, I get to, as soon as that baby's born, I get to hold that baby, So, for those that have given birth, it was without pain, right? When did the pain stop? Never stop? Still going on? Yeah. Most of the time, the pain, if it doesn't stop, it is severely lessened the moment the baby's born, because it carries both pain and blessing at the same time. All right. So that's the analogy of the New Testament. Now, but just consider that the pearl, the wilderness, whatever the analogy we might want to use, that carries with it both pain and blessing at the same time. Because why is the reason most people can't fulfill a diet? Yeah, it's all Patty's fault because she brings the caramel cake. So, what's that? Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Most of us are good at starting it. We just don't finish it. Why? It's because it takes pain. Discipline. So whatever it may be. I mean, we can pick any other example. It could be exercise. We did a sermon series at the beginning of the year, Big Faith, One Thing, and I shared with you that I had for years have neglected my body. Well, this year I've changed a lot of that. Changed what I eat. That Peloton bike I love and hate, but I'm seeing some of the effects of it. And there are times where, man, I just hate that thing. It is what it is. Every growth process on whatever if you want to talk about physical, mental, emotional, relational, whatever it may be, it involves both pain and blessing at the same time. Why would it be different when it comes to God? And most people who can't see it through is because they only think about this and not what can be here. So call it for what it is. Just recognize that it's there. And we all got it, all right, in various forms. There isn't a single one of us in here that don't have some struggle with one of these on some level, right? But we're not alone. And the process of holiness is not a solo endeavor. which means you and the very Spirit of God is moving here. That central shrine is His. And the Holy Spirit will not stop until what's His is His. Which means conviction is a good thing. It is. Conviction is the spiritual understanding that you're still alive and you're not dead. So give thanks for it. That's the reminder of, hey, we've still got work to do. And you do it with the Holy Spirit, and in the process of that, it's both going to be painful and it's going to be joyful in the process. Okay? That's chapter 2. Now it came out of Tozer dealing with the love of his daughter. And driving home one day where he said, I know I pledged all these things to you, God, but I did not mean them. Go in peace.